Welcome back to Module 5, Emotional Behavior Disorders. We want to continue looking at some of the causes to EBD, and the book identifies really three areas that can contribute to a student being diagnosed with EBD. One is biological causes, and here we're talking about the brain function and genetics and the role that that plays in students developing some of these disorders related to EBD. And we know that there really is a strong response within brain function about depression, about schizophrenia, and those kinds of things. We also know genetically that students are born with a particular temperament, right? If you're born with a temperament where you're naturally maybe resistant to guidance, you're impulsive, then your environment can really play a big factor in how you develop those skills, whether you're in have some negative outcomes within your environment that allow that temperament, those tendencies to be resistant to influence and to guidance, allows you to develop a disability, for example, a defiant disorder, oppositional defiant disorder. Okay. Or if you're in an environment that has more positive outcomes, maybe you're able to kind of work through those tendencies and they don't become so significant that it impacts your learning. One of the things we also want to look at is school factors. I mentioned earlier when I began this module video that most of you identified students with EBD as an area of interest that you have. And the reason that is because typically as teachers we are not necessarily prepared to work with students with significant behavior disorders. We don't receive a lot of training in college about teaching social skills or developing behavior intervention plans, but we are seeing students in our classroom that have pretty significant behavior needs. And so schools really are not equipped yet with really good evidence-based practices and skills to apply to help these students be successful in the classroom. You'll notice in the story that you read at the beginning of the chapter about Michael's history that he had some teachers and some administrators who had a negative attitude, didn't really have the skill set they needed to help him. And then parents found some administrators and teachers who had high expectations for him, who were willing to learn and do some of those little things that they commented on that made a difference for him. So school can really play a big difference in the life of a student with EBD and their family. Okay. Family factors were also discussed in the text. I think this is really important to remember. Really what they talked about, the pervasive impact of low socioeconomic status and poverty. And the reason I talk about this is I've been reading a lot about this, and I find this really interesting, and I find that it really gives us some good background information on why our students learn the way they do and why they behave the way they do. Because some of this is a biological response based on the environment that they're growing up in. I mentioned before the book that I've been reading called How Children Succeed. This book takes a look at a study that was done called the ACE study, and this is interesting. It's called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and the reason that I want to talk about this is because this really identifies for us how students respond to stress and trauma in their life. And when we have students who are living in poverty, they are more likely to have stressful experiences because of the situation of poverty and the things that happen as a result of living in poverty. And what this does is this is looked at students identifying responses that they have had to adverse child experiences. So they go through a survey. They've got 10 different categories of questions they answer, everything from divorce to living with a family member who's been incarcerated, living with a family member who is battling addiction, abuse, neglect, physical and emotional neglect. Lots of different questions that fall underneath those 10 different categories. And what they found is there's a staggering correlation between students who have those adverse childhood experiences and then negative adult outcomes. One of the interesting things they talked about is that students develop this long-lasting negative effect because the body has been in this stress reaction mode for so long, even as an infant, through a toddler and young childhood years. It really has a long-term impact on these students. One of the things that was interesting to me as the physicians did this study, they found that students who had an ACE score of 0, so they identified no adverse childhood experiences, just 3% had been identified as having a learning or behavioral problem. But when they looked at patients with an ACE score of 4 or higher, so they identified 4 adverse childhood experiences, whether that was divorce or separation, drug addiction, those things that I mentioned, they were 51% likely to have a learning or behavioral problem. Okay, so we really see that those childhood experiences are really resulting in challenges for students as they come into the school environment and they try to learn. What they found is that these kids who grew up in stressful environments found it harder to concentrate, harder to sit still, harder to rebound from disappointment, harder to follow directions. Think about the students that you work with and them having challenges with those things. You can see how some of that is based on environment, some of the situations that they have been through. One of the things that the researchers of this study looked at is that they can actually improve executive function of these students, improve on those things that we talked about they have challenges with, by really focusing on teaching executive function skills. That was the way they found that they could really close the achievement gap between students who are living in poverty and middle class students. So if this is something you're interested in, if you work with students who are living in poverty, who are really struggling with low socioeconomic status and all the factors that play into that, I really encourage you to read this because it does really give us some good tips on how to teach executive function to these students. This is just a breakdown of some of the research that was done on this. When you look at how in this study students and kids responded, you'll notice some of the high percentages. Like 27% of them were living in a household with substance abuse, 23% separation and divorce. We know that number is higher. Physical abuse, 28%. So when we add all of those up, each time they say yes to one of those, that means they have an ACE, is what they call it. So if you look at how many have 4 or more ACEs, that's 12.5%. That's a pretty large population in that community. 9.5% have 3 or more. So we're learning that these kinds of experiences really mold students, mold their brains, mold their body's response, and there's a long-term impact on that. So I just think for us as teachers, it's really helpful for us to see the whole picture of the student that's sitting in front of us, the factors that are impacting their learning and impacting how successful they are in our classroom. So one of the things that the text talked about was the wraparound IEP process, and I really like this because I feel like this, if we implement this wraparound IEP process, students go through the transition process much more successfully. They transition out of high school already connected and embedded with these services that can help them as adults, and that's why I think it's so important. So when we look at the wraparound IEP process, we're looking at how the school, the community, mental health, and other services play a part in working with the student. Now when we look at the community, there's some things that we can look at there, and I want to point several of these out to you. One is a waiver program that the state of Kansas uses. If you're in Missouri, if you're in Oklahoma, they will have a serious program, but this is called the SPED waiver program. It's for serious emotional disturbances. It's provided for children who have a mental health condition that need intensive supports in their home and in their communities. And so the reason I would direct parents to this resource is because it provides parent support. It helps provide some of that wraparound facilitation, so it can help the school with some training. It can even send support folks into the school to help the student. Also provides respite care for parents, which is so critical for these students who have behavior disorders. This is one of the areas that families will feel the most isolated with, is a student that has a behavior disorder, okay, because it's impacting everything in their home life. impacts what they can do outside of the home. And so it's really good to connect them to these community resources, state resources, to get that short-term respite care. The other thing that we find with these families is typically they are financially struggling because these students require some things like therapy that are not always covered by insurance. And through the waiver program, they become eligible for Medicaid, which provides some of that insurance assistance, which I think is so important. So if you work with students in this area, I would really encourage parents to look at this waiver program. The other thing is looking at your county mental health facilities. So here I'm connecting to Crawford County Mental Health, which is in close to Pittsburgh State in the same county. But you'll see they have several different things here related to rehab specialists for community-based rehab, which is really great. After-school programs, summer skills groups, adolescents, for these students to continue working on those behavioral skills. Crisis intervention. So if parents are really struggling, if they're ready for an inpatient situation because they're struggling so much, they have a 24-hour emergency line where you can talk to clinicians and get assistance. Home-based family therapy, which is really critical for these families. So all kinds of things that community mental health organizations do, county mental health organizations. I would really encourage you to look at this. The student that I mentioned earlier, working with at VBS that we had to restrain, his parents have become involved with our county mental health here in Kansas City, and they're providing support to the school and providing training and coming in and really being a tool for the school to use too, which is so critical to have those community connections. And so that's something else I encourage you to look at within your county that you live in, what services are available. And then the other thing you might consider sending parents to is Children's Mercy has a developmental behavioral sciences department that does a lot of the clinical diagnosis of students with EBD, but they have what they call care workshops for parents, which are really great resources for parents to work on things like this year they're working on kind of two areas: strategies for compliance. So how do we effectively manage behavior and discipline in the house, working with students that have some real problematic behaviors. And then relationship enhancement, so developing positive communication with your child. These two things are really critical areas that parents struggle with. And so this is something that they can attend here in Kansas City. They have evening times and day times, depending on what you need. But that's another thing I might encourage parents to look at if you feel like that's a resource that they are looking for. And so, you know, as we get into this IEP development process, you're working with a student with EBD, I think it's really critical, even in those elementary years, to think about what connections are we making for this family and this child within the community, within mental health, within other services that are available to us outside of school, to really have this wraparound IEP process that's going to follow them through K-12. And then the nice thing is when they graduate, they're already connected to their county mental health. They're already on the waiver system, which is going to provide job training and continue to provide them assistance. So they're not just on their own at 18 trying to figure out what they're going to do. And so I just encourage you to think about these things as you're going through that IEP process. So the next thing you're going to want to do is go to the activity within the module, and it's going to have a link for each of these IRIS modules. This was developed by the IRIS organization, and these are modules that typically take about an hour, and they have an assessment piece with them. They'll have some assessment questions you can access before you even begin. But these are the topics that I have selected, so you can choose one that most closely relates to something you're interested in. If you're really struggling with non-compliant behaviors in the classroom, that first one is a great one to really look at behavioral interventions, really good concrete ideas you can take into the classroom. If you're working with students in an early childhood setting, I encourage you to take a look at that one. It talks about developing and teaching rules, which is so important for those really young kids to start working on and start being able to take guidance from adults. if you're not sure about how to put together a behavior management plan, and or you've put some together but you feel like you still have some growth you can do there, that learning the components of a comprehensive behavior plan is a great module. Also, the second one as well, developing your own. So if you feel like you have a pretty good understanding of behavior management plans, but you want to look at how can you make yours unique and really plug in some different interventions, that's a good one to look at. I know we have some folks here who work in juvenile corrections or work in residential facilities, work in alternative schools. Some of these, the last two, either improving instruction in juvenile corrections or transition and reentry to school and community, I would encourage you to look at either one of those. I think they'll be closely aligned with what you do in your current position. So don't hesitate to ask me if you have any questions. You will be submitting your answers to the assessment part of whichever module you select. So that will be your assignment for this EBD module. And I encourage you to reach out if you have questions.